Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter time. The lights are low, the room is still, and together we're going to slip into the candlelit corridors of royal palaces, where secrets once whispered behind velvet curtains and love affairs were as political as they were personal. So, if you haven't already, take a breath, settle under your blanket, and make sure your tea hasn't gone cold. Because tonight's story isn't about the kings you learned in school. It's about the women history preferred to forget, royal mistresses, those mysterious figures who glittered at court one moment and vanished the next. When the king lived, they were untouchable. But when he died, well, let's just say life became considerably less comfortable. Let's start with a small, awkward truth. For most of history, everybody knew the king had a mistress. It wasn't scandalous, it was expected. Marriage was a matter of politics. Mistresses were a matter of mood, and those moods could change as quickly as the European weather. Now, being a royal mistress came with all sorts of perks, gifts, titles, country estates, the occasional diamond-encrusted horse saddle if the monarch was feeling whimsical. But what few people considered was the moment after. What happened when the king, their golden ticket, was gone? Well, it depended on the kingdom, the era, and how many powerful enemies the lady had collected along the way. Spoiler: it was usually quite a few. Let's drift to France first, because of course France perfected the art of the mistress. They even had an official title for it, maîtresse en titre, which basically meant primary royal side project. It was a legitimate court position, complete with servants, apartments, and jealous rivals. One of the most famous of these women was Madame de Pompadour. Her real name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, which, yes, does translate to Mrs. Fish. But she made up for the unfortunate surname by becoming the absolute center of King Louis XV's world. Pompadour was smart, charming, and most importantly, knew how to make herself useful. She didn't just entertain the king. She managed his schedule, influenced art commissions, and occasionally ran France when he couldn't be bothered, which was often. But then, inevitably, he died. And Pompadour? She didn't live to see the fall. She died 4 years before him, which, in the business of royal mistressing, was really the best possible outcome. Because when the king died, everyone connected to him instantly became disposable furniture. Take Madame du Barry, Louis XV's next mistress. She wasn't from the noble elite. She was a commoner, a former courtesan, which made her an easy target for aristocratic sneers. When Louis XV died in 1774, the new king, Louis XVI, was not particularly fond of his grandfather's girlfriend, and Marie Antoinette despised her. Within hours, du Barry was expelled from Versailles. No farewell party, no graceful retirement, just, "Thank you for your service. Please exit through the servants' gate." She was sent off to a convent, because apparently that was where ex-mistresses went for moral detox. She did eventually leave, but life after court was a series of diminishing returns. When the revolution came, her extravagant past made her an easy target. She tried to escape. She tried to bribe the guards, but the guillotine, as usual, had the final word. So yes, the short version is, being the king's favorite could end in diamonds or decapitation. Usually both, just not in the same lifetime. Let's drift northward to England, where mistresses fared not much better, but at least there were fewer guillotines. The English monarchy has a long and inconsistent relationship with royal side affairs. Some kings flaunted them, others pretended they didn't happen. But the truth was always the same. once the king was gone, the mistress's protection disappeared overnight. Consider Nell Gwynn, the famously witty mistress of King Charles II. She was an actress, known for her charm, her laugh, and her remarkable ability to insult people without losing her head. When Charles died in 1685, Nell found herself in a precarious position. 2 sons by the late king, plenty of jealous nobles, and very few friends in high places. But Charles, to his credit, made one final request on his deathbed. He told his brother James, "Let not poor Nellie starve." And somehow that was enough. James granted her a pension, and she lived quietly until her death. It was a rare happy ending in a profession that didn't often allow them. Of course, not all mistresses were as lucky or as likable. Barbara Palmer, the Duchess of Cleveland, another mistress of Charles II, was described as violently beautiful and violently everything else. She spent money like the crown printed it for her personally. When the king died, she lost her titles, her fortune, and her patience, all in rapid succession. Barbara ended her days isolated, surrounded by debts, with far more portraits of herself than friends. It was, in a sense, poetic justice. She had collected power through beauty, and when beauty faded, so did everything else. Let's glide now into the 18th century, where Europe's courts were more powdered than ever, and hypocrisy had reached an art form. Mistresses became semi-official figures in diplomacy. If a foreign ambassador wanted to get something done, it was often faster to send a gift to the king's mistress than to the king himself. But this created a problem. When the king died, all those bribes, jewels, and promises became evidence. In Spain, one notable mistress, Maria Luisa de Parma, was said to have wielded more influence than the entire cabinet combined. When her royal lover died, courtiers immediately began reclaiming her gifts, meaning stealing them under the excuse of royal property. She died penniless, her reputation reduced to gossip. There's something tragically consistent here. Royal mistresses lived like queens without crowns, but crowns, unlike hearts, came with a line of succession. When one ruler died, another took over, and loyalty had to reset itself accordingly. In other words, the new regime didn't want reminders of the old one sleeping in a gold-embroidered bed just down the hall. So they were shipped away, to the countryside, to convents, to forced marriages with minor nobles who couldn't possibly say no. And history quietly erased them, because the official story of a monarchy prefers clean lines, kings, queens, heirs, not the messy, human details in between. But some women refuse to fade away. One of my personal favorites, and yes, that's a strange phrase to use for royal mistresses, is Catherine Walters, better known as Skittles. She wasn't technically royal, but her career mirrored theirs perfectly. She was a 19th century courtesan in England, beloved by aristocrats, rumored to have been involved with the future King Edward VII. When her patrons aged, she retired gracefully, invested her money wisely, and lived out her days in quiet luxury. In a way, she cracked the code. She took the royal mistress model and added a pension plan. It was, perhaps, the first successful businesswoman's blueprint for the profession. By contrast, the earlier centuries were far less forgiving. In medieval Europe, being a royal mistress wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous. There was no protection, no titles, no expectation that anyone would look kindly on you once the king was gone. The church loathed you, the queen despised you, and the courtiers feared you because you had seen too much. Some mistresses were quietly married off to aging barons to restore their honor. Others disappeared into nunneries conveniently removed from public life before the gossip could get too detailed. The lucky ones left behind letters, snippets of humanity reminding us that these women weren't villains or seductresses, but products of systems that offered them no other route to influence. One of the saddest examples is Agnes Sorel, the mistress of Charles VII of France in the 15th century. She was considered one of the first official royal mistresses, meaning she held recognized status at court. Agnes was admired for her beauty, her taste in fashion. She was the one who made low-cut gowns popular, much to the horror of the clergy, and her ability to soothe a moody monarch. When she died suddenly at the age of 28, rumors swirled. Some claimed poison, others said childbirth, but the truth was probably simpler: mercury poisoning from her cosmetics. After her death, she was buried in a chapel near Loches, and Charles reportedly visited her tomb often, overcome with guilt. A rare instance of a king actually mourning a mistress instead of just replacing her. If there's a theme emerging here, it's this: royal mistresses lived extraordinary lives, but on borrowed time. Their power came from proximity to a single man's heartbeat, and when that stopped, so did everything else. In the 17th and 18th centuries, mistresses were adored in life, reviled in death, and largely erased in history. Only their jewels and portraits survived, and even those were sometimes repurposed for the next favorite, because monarchy, for all its grandeur, was built on impermanence. Even kings were temporary. Let's pause here for a moment, take a breath, maybe adjust your pillow, because in the next part, we'll drift further into the European courts that turned mistresses into institutions, where influence, scandal, and survival were practically forms of art. We'll explore the lives of the women who outsmarted the system, and those who, quite literally, lost their heads trying. But for now, let the candles flicker out in the back of your mind. And remember, behind every king's story, there's always someone else's silence. If you're still awake, consider subscribing. It helps the channel reach more curious night owls like you. But no pressure. You can always drift off first. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still with me from part 1, congratulations. Either you're dedicated or you simply haven't fallen asleep yet. Both are valid choices. Tonight, we're gliding gently into the dim, smoky corners of the medieval world. A time when people didn't quite understand why they died, only that they did frequently and in spectacularly unpleasant ways. Our subject tonight is the plague, the Black Death, the Great Mortality, or, if you prefer the local medieval nicknames, God's Wrath, the Pestilence, and my personal favorite, that terrible thing. The plague swept through Europe like a rumor with very good legs. Between 1347 and 1353, it killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population. That's not an exaggeration. That's just a level of efficiency we generally associate with natural disasters and bad decision-making. And yet, humans being humans, they didn't give up quietly. They tried everything they could think of to outsmart death. The problem was, they didn't know what they were fighting. Let's set the scene. It's the mid-14th century. The streets are narrow. The air smells like medieval things. Someone has just emptied a chamber pot out a window, and you're walking under it. Medicine, such as it was, mostly involved bleeding, chanting, or the application of something freshly dead. When people began dropping by the thousands, panic was immediate, and logic was optional. Doctors, priests, and mystics all offered solutions, each more creative than the last. The leading theory was that the plague came from bad air, also known as miasma. In other words, they believed disease floated invisibly around them, carried by foul smells, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong, just missing the microscopic bacteria part. So naturally, they tried to make the air smell better. One of the most popular methods was carrying posies, little bundles of herbs and flowers meant to ward off the bad vapors: roses, lavender, sage, even crushed mint. If it smelled nice, people stuffed it into their sleeves, their pockets, or directly under their noses. Doctors took it to another level. You've probably seen those famous plague doctor costumes, the long black robes, the wide-brimmed hats, and of course the beaked masks. Those weren't meant to look terrifying. That was just a lucky coincidence. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs: cinnamon, cloves, juniper berries, and occasionally vinegar-soaked sponges. Essentially, medieval Febreze. The idea was that if you could block out the bad air, you'd block out the plague. Spoiler, it didn't work. But on the bright side, they at least smelled pleasant while dying. Now, if pleasant smells didn't save you, you could always try fire. Many believed smoke purified the air, so people burned anything they could get their hands on: juniper wood, tar, herbs, even piles of old clothes. Whole towns were filled with choking, fragrant fog. Imagine trying to escape a pandemic while your neighbors are all running impromptu incense festivals. And if the air wasn't to blame, well, maybe it was the stars. Astrologers, who in medieval Europe were basically the same people as doctors, consulted the heavens for answers. One popular theory was that the plague had been caused by a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. Apparently, when those three planets lined up, Earth just got unlucky. It was the cosmic equivalent of being in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Then there were the treatments. And oh, the treatments. Few things demonstrate humanity's creativity better than our attempts to avoid dying. Doctors prescribed bloodletting, because of course they did. They loved bloodletting. The logic was that sickness came from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, you clearly had too much of something, and the best way to fix that was to poke a hole in you until you didn't. Others believed you could draw out the plague by applying pigeons to your swollen lymph nodes. Yes, actual pigeons, preferably alive. You would strap the bird to your armpit, wait for it to die, and then replace it with a fresh one, because apparently the only thing more contagious than the plague was optimism. There were also protective elixirs. Recipes varied by region, but the general formula was: mix expensive ingredients, hope for the best. One 14th century potion included crushed emeralds. Another used ground pearls and wine. If you couldn't afford jewels, garlic and vinegar were acceptable substitutes. None of it worked, obviously. But it did wonders for the jewel merchants. And then there was the vinegar trick. People soaked coins, hands, or sponges in vinegar before touching anything, convinced it could kill disease. Ironically, this one almost worked, since vinegar actually does have mild antibacterial properties. Unfortunately, not nearly enough to stop Yersinia pestis. Some people preferred spiritual solutions, because if the plague was God's punishment, maybe God could be persuaded to stop. So they prayed. A lot. Monasteries filled with chanting monks. Villagers formed processions, walking barefoot through towns, carrying candles and crosses. Some even joined the flagellants, roving bands of religious zealots who whipped themselves publicly to atone for humanity's sins. They traveled from city to city, shirtless, bleeding, singing hymns between blows. It was a moving display of faith and an excellent way to spread the disease faster, because naturally they didn't isolate. They just carried the plague along with their moral superiority from town to town. And if divine forgiveness didn't come fast enough, there was always blame. In times of fear, humans love an explanation, and if they can't find one, they make one. During the plague, Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells or plotting to destroy Christendom. It was baseless, tragic, and deadly. Thousands were killed in pogroms, violence that spread almost as fast as the plague itself. It didn't stop the disease, of course, but it gave people the temporary comfort of thinking they'd done something. Because doing something, even something terrible, often feels easier than doing nothing. Let's drift over to the wealthy, because they had their own ways of cheating death. The rich simply left. When the plague hit, nobles and merchants packed up their households and fled to the countryside. If you could afford to work from home in 1348, you had a much better chance of survival. One of the most famous examples comes from Italy, specifically from Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. It tells the story of 10 young nobles who fled Florence to escape the plague and passed the time telling each other mildly scandalous stories in a villa. It was, in essence, the first recorded example of rich people waiting out a crisis by making content. But not everyone could run. For peasants and townsfolk, home was wherever the rats were, which unfortunately was everywhere. Some tried to seal out death. They closed windows, locked doors, and hung amulets over their beds. A popular charm was the abracadabra triangle. Yes, the word magicians still used today. People wrote it on parchment, arranged in a shrinking triangle of letters, and wore it as a talisman against disease. If you're wondering why abracadabra was supposed to stop the plague, so was everyone else. But it was worth a try. Food and drink offered another line of defense. Medical texts from the era advised strengthening the heart with moderate drinking, preferably wine because water was suspicious. People were told to eat dry foods, avoid bathing, and under no circumstances eat fruit. Fruit was moist, and moisture, apparently, was how you died. So, to recap, don't wash, don't hydrate, don't eat oranges, just wine, bread, and hope. It's amazing anyone made it through. Even the church struggled to keep up. Priests couldn't bless all the dead fast enough. Graveyards overflowed. Bodies were buried in mass pits, sometimes covered with lime, sometimes just stacked. And through it all, people kept inventing new ways to not die. In Venice, doctors recommended burning aromatic wood and sprinkling vinegar on floors. In Paris, the university recommended avoiding sex and bathing. In England, some believed wearing rubies could protect the heart. To be fair, if you're wearing rubies, you're probably not doing manual labor, so technically, that did improve your odds. There were also the truly bizarre attempts. In Germany, people rubbed onions and butter on their sores. In Poland, some recommended pressing frogs to the buboes until they swelled and burst. And in Hungary, they used human excrement as an ointment, which frankly might explain the life expectancy. If all else failed, some simply tried to outdrink the plague. A group in 14th century England formed what was known as the Merry Fellowship of the Plague. Their motto was simple: if death's coming anyway, might as well enjoy the ale. You could say they invented the medieval lockdown party. The tragedy of all this, of course, is that none of it worked, at least not directly. What did make a difference were the things people didn't fully understand yet: isolation, cleaner streets, fewer fleas. In some towns, quarantines were introduced and mortality dropped. The city of Dubrovnik established a 30-day isolation for arriving ships, later extended to 40. They called it a quarantina, and that's where the word quarantine comes from. It was one of the few ideas that actually stuck around and still saves lives today. When the worst of the plague finally passed, Europe was transformed. There were fewer people, fewer workers, and, strangely, more opportunities for those who survived. Wages rose. Serfdom began to crumble. Entire towns vanished, but those that remained had a chance to start again. The plague reshaped society not through medicine, but through sheer necessity. And in that dark, fumbling way, humanity learned a few small lessons about cause and effect, lessons that would eventually grow into modern science. But for centuries after, people remembered it less as a turning point and more as a warning. Death can't be bargained with, only delayed. And sometimes all the candles, jewels, and pigeons in the world can't make a difference. Take another breath. If you're awake, let it out slowly. If you're half asleep, that's fine too. History can keep talking quietly in the background. Next time, we'll drift into another corner of the past, the peculiar lives of sickly, spoiled, and sad royal children, the ones bred for crowns, but raised in rooms full of fear. But for now, just rest in the comforting thought that you, unlike your medieval ancestors, know what soap is for. If this story helped you drift off, you can gently tap subscribe before sleep. It helps the channel grow, quietly, like an ancient library full of half-forgotten ghosts. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, well done. If you've drifted in halfway through this video, that's fine too. We're still somewhere in the Middle Ages, where people believed that sleeping flat on your back could actually kill you. Tonight, we're going to lie down, or rather sit up, with medieval nobles and explore the strange, slightly paranoid world of historical sleeping habits. Because once again, the past manages to make the simple act of resting sound vaguely life-threatening. Now, if you picture a medieval bed, you might imagine something grand and fluffy. Perhaps a carved wooden frame with velvet curtains and a sense of royal dignity. And you'd be half right. The wealthy did have massive four-posters, often draped with embroidered canopies to keep out drafts, insects, and the occasional rat with ambitions. But inside those beds, they didn't lie flat like we do. They propped themselves up on pillows, sometimes almost vertical, like they were perpetually reading in bed, but without the book. Why? Well, there wasn't one reason. There were many, and most of them made perfect sense to medieval people, and none at all to us. Let's start with the most basic, health. Doctors, by which I mean people who owned long robes and theories, believed that lying flat could cause your internal organs to shift downward and press on your heart. This apparently could lead to suffocation in your sleep, so they recommended sleeping in a semi-upright position to keep your body's humors properly balanced. Remember, these are the same humors we met earlier: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Everything was about balance. You didn't want your bile migrating during the night. If you were wealthy, you'd have a mountain of cushions behind you, holding you in a dignified, slightly uncomfortable half-sitting posture. You'd drift off, tilted forward like a thoughtful gargoyle. Then there was the spiritual reason. Medieval people were obsessed with death. Understandably so, given the plagues, wars, and general lack of antibiotics. Lying flat to them looked, well, dead. It was the traditional posture of corpses. To lie fully flat was to mimic the dead, an invitation, perhaps, for the Grim Reaper to stop by and make it official. So, to be safe, nobles preferred to sleep propped up halfway between life and whatever came next. Some even believed that sleeping upright made it easier for the soul to escape through the mouth during dreams, and more importantly, to find its way back in the morning, because no one wanted to wake up soulless before breakfast. But fear of death wasn't the only reason. There were also very practical concerns, namely, breathing. Medieval castles were cold, smoky, and dusty. Fireplaces belched soot. Candles released wax fumes. People suffered from constant coughs, asthma, and other ailments generously provided by centuries of indoor smoke. Sleeping upright made it easier to breathe in that fog. If you had pneumonia, or more likely, something nobody had yet named, it was simply more comfortable not to lie flat. The wealthy, of course, turned this into a virtue. If peasants slept flat on straw, nobles reasoned, surely it was more refined to sleep halfway to heaven. There's another explanation, too: etiquette. In the grand halls of the Middle Ages, privacy was a rumor. Even kings didn't really sleep alone. Servants, attendants, guards, children, dogs, everyone might be in the same room. If someone entered unexpectedly in the night, it was considered unseemly to be caught sprawling flat like a commoner, or, heaven forbid, like a corpse. Better to be upright, alert, and ready to receive whoever might wander in with important news, or more likely, a candle and bad timing. The bed, you see, wasn't just for sleeping. It was a stage. Nobles received guests in bed. They took audiences in bed. They gave orders, conducted gossip, even signed documents while reclining under embroidered blankets. Being in bed didn't mean being off duty. It was just a slightly more horizontal extension of court life. So sitting up wasn't just health conscious. It was politically practical. And let's not forget fashion, because medieval Europe adored discomfort when it looked impressive. Sleepwear for nobles wasn't exactly cozy. They often wore layers of linen, nightcaps, and sometimes even jewelry to bed, because you never knew who might drop by to see you resting in elegance. Sleeping bolt upright in a mountain of fabric was practically an art form. If you managed to get any real rest, it was probably out of pure exhaustion. But my favorite reason, because it's both practical and ridiculous, is the fear of stomach gas. Yes, medieval doctors warned that lying flat could cause vapors from the stomach to rise and choke the sleeper. This was apparently a major concern in 14th century health manuals. So, the solution was to sit up, allowing one's digestive vapors to circulate politely instead of staging a coup. If you've ever had heartburn, you might admit they were almost on to something. But as usual, medieval medicine took a mild discomfort and turned it into doctrine. Another factor, the furniture itself. Medieval beds were not as comfortable as the fairy tales suggest. They were high, sometimes absurdly high, because cold air gathered near the floor. Servants had to bring little stools or steps to climb into them. Some were stuffed with straw, others with feathers, depending on your tax bracket. The angle of the bed often sloped downward toward the foot, making full reclining difficult anyway. So, the semi-sitting position wasn't just superstition, it was ergonomics, 14th century style. There's also the matter of nighttime danger. Castles were drafty, noisy, and not particularly secure. Being upright meant you could, theoretically, grab a dagger and look intimidating if someone burst in. Even in the middle of the night, appearances mattered. And of course, there was the ever-present concern of demons, because naturally, Medieval Europe assumed the devil had a very active social life between midnight and dawn. It was believed that sleeping flat exposed you to night presses, spirits or demons who sat on your chest and stole your breath. This is actually one of the earliest descriptions of what we now call sleep paralysis. Back then, they simply blamed invisible evil creatures. And once you've been told demons attack the supine, you'll sleep sitting up too. Some nobles even designed elaborate bed setups. Queen Elizabeth II reportedly slept surrounded by curtains, tapestries, and multiple layers of linens, not only for warmth, but also because privacy and mystery were fashionable. Sleeping upright, swaddled in velvet, with candles flickering around you, it wasn't just a bedtime posture. It was a performance, and it sent a clear message. Even in rest, nobles were different. Peasants could sprawl. Kings and queens composed themselves. By the Renaissance, this habit began to fade. As medicine improved, slightly, and homes became less smoky, people rediscovered the joy of lying flat. But even into the 17th century, many portraits show aristocrats reclining with an unmistakable slant, as if ready to spring into polite conversation at any moment. It's funny, really. We spend so much of history trying to be comfortable, while they spent theirs trying not to look too mortal. Imagine it. You're a medieval noble. The fire is crackling weakly in the corner. Your room smells faintly of beeswax and smoke. You're wearing 3 layers of linen and something that feels suspiciously like armor. You climb into a bed so high you could rent out the space underneath. Then you carefully arrange yourself, upright, dignified, not too relaxed, not too dead-looking, and you fall asleep, hoping that between the drafts, the demons, and your own digestion, you'll wake up in the same general condition. There's something oddly comforting about it, though. For all their superstition, medieval people weren't so different from us. They worried about their health. They feared unseen dangers. They built rituals around rest, because rest felt fragile. Maybe sitting up was just another way of saying, I'm still here. A small, stubborn gesture of survival in a world that didn't make it easy. So if you're lying in bed right now, flat, comfortable, and alive, take a moment to appreciate that luxury. You're doing something that would have horrified your 14th century ancestors. You've cheated both death and decorum all in one night. And honestly, that's progress. Let your breathing slow a little. The medieval world fades away, the smoke, the candles, the endless theories about bile and demons. We'll drift next time into the strange realm of witch marks and the hunt for the devil's touch, where paranoia, skin inspections, and very poor science collided for centuries. But for now, rest easy. Lie flat. You've earned it. And if you're still barely awake, you can softly subscribe before sleep. Quietly, of course, so you don't startle the ghosts of medieval physicians still insisting you sit up straight.